So in this video, we're going to continue talking about conservatism, and we're going to look at how conservatism was used by conservative leaders. So as we'll call this conservatism in action. So to talk about this topic, we've got to look at what happened to the little Germanys after Napoleon was defeated. So remember that Napoleon kind of forced all the little Germanys into this thing called the Confederation of the Rhine. And in doing so, also caused the end of the Holy Roman Empire. And this all happened in 1806. So once Napoleon was gone, the Holy Roman Empire was gone, the Confederation of the Rhine was gone. So at the Congress of Vienna, a new loose union of all the little Germanys was created. A new kind of union of the little Germanys was formed. And this thing was known as the German Confederation. So the German Confederation had 40 pieces, which is a lot fewer than the Holy Roman Empire had. So it had 40 pieces, including Austria and Prussia, who were the two big members of the German Confederation. Austria was kind of the unofficial leader. Prussia was Austria's challenger. Now, this is not Germany. That won't happen for a while. So this is not Germany, but it's a little more politically connected than the Holy Roman Empire was. Because remember, after the Peace of Westphalia, the Holy Roman Empire was really just a name. It really didn't have any real power. So this has some actual political connection. It's also got more economic union, and I think we've mentioned this before. We've talked about the Zollverein, but we'll talk about that a lot more once we get to the actual German unification story. So we've got this thing called the German Confederation. And Austria is the one that is in charge of it, which means that Metternich is kind of pulling the strings here. So the Austrian emperor is the leader, but Metternich pulls the strings. Metternich is the guy that decides what ends up happening. So with this in mind, let's look at an example of how conservatism was used by a political leader. So the best example of this are a series of laws that have become known as the Carlsbad Decrees, which were enacted in 1819. So here's what happened that caused the Carlsbad Decrees to come about. In 1819, a famous conservative writer was killed by a liberal college student. More than likely, it wasn't a political thing. Politics might have had something to do with it, but it might have just been an argument. But in any event, it doesn't really matter. What matters is that a conservative writer was killed by a liberal college student. The actual story doesn't matter because Metternich is going to use this as a way to crack down on people who are not conservative. So as soon as this happens, Metternich views this as an opportunity to enact some conservative laws. And so this happens, and Metternich is able to give all the other little Germanys a comprehensive set of laws, set of regulations and restrictions to counter this kind of revolutionary action. Now, this wasn't a revolutionary action. And Metternich had this ready to go. He had this ready. He just needed an excuse to hand it out. And the death of this famous conservative writer was just the excuse he needed. So he had this in a drawer, ready to go. And as soon as there was an opportunity, he's like, everybody do this. And the other little Germanys were like, wow, this is just the thing we need. What a coincidence that you had this ready to go. So here's some of the stuff that were in the Carlsbad Decrees. So we get a big clampdown on freedom of speech. Especially as it comes to liberalism and nationalism. I know we haven't really covered these things yet, but just note that a conservative reaction would be to clamp down on freedom of speech. There was also a lot of censorship of published material. So now, anything that was published inside the German Confederation was subject to censorship. Now, this was a change. Before this, it was only anything over 20 pages. Now, it's anything. Anything published had to be submitted to the censors. It strengthened the secret police to spy on possible liberals or radicals. And created postal inspectors to read the mail. So the big effect of all of this was that Metternich through a series of spies and secret police officers and postal inspectors knew just about everything happening in the German Confederation, with the idea being that they could stop any rebellion before it started. And it worked. Until it didn't work. But we won't worry about that until later. But generally speaking, it worked. Now, this is an important point that often gets forgotten when we talk about conservatism. We often focus on the bad parts. Like if we're thinking about this in terms of the carrot and the stick, like punishments versus rewards, So the stick part of the equation. So this is the part we usually focus on. Metternich also knew that without a pressure release, people would rebel anyway. No matter what he did, if he didn't offer the people some way of relieving their pressure, there would be a rebellion no matter what he did. It would happen spontaneously, which, spoiler alert, is pretty much what ends up happening. Metternich understood that unless he put in a pressure release system, the people would rebel anyway. So we often forget that Metternich also wanted to put release mechanisms to prevent rebellions into the system. Like, he wanted a level of democracy. Basically, letting people have a voice in government to keep them happy. Happy people don't rebel. And if people have a voice, even a small voice, they're less likely to rebel. Unfortunately, these parts of the conservative system were ignored in favor of more punishments. And ultimately, that is going to end conservative Europe. But we're not there yet. So we'll get to that point. But the lack of a pressure release, giving people some say in the government, is ultimately what's going to cause this system to come crashing down. Metternich knew that that would cause the system to crash, but nobody implemented the stuff Metternich wanted to implement. And so it ends up falling apart. So in our next set of videos, we're going to look at the other side. So if conservatism is about going back to where we were and fighting against revolution, liberalism is going to say, well, maybe revolution wasn't so good, but we still need to keep moving forward. And that's what we're going to turn to in our next set of videos when we start looking at classical liberalism. So until then, this is Mr. Nissen signing off.